the move that Anand played helped me overcome chess related mindset block and widened my perspective and understanding of the game. Hello my dear friend, how are you doing today? Candidate Master Ranveer Mohite here. In this video, I am going to show you a Ruy Lopez masterpiece played by India's greatest chess hero Viswanathan Anand. So Anand opens the game with e4, to which Black plays the move e5. With Black is playing Rustam Kasimdzhanov. For those of you who don't know, he is a legend from Uzbekistan. I believe in 2004 he became the FIDE world champion. He has worked as a second, as a helper to many of the top players in the world, like Anand himself. He also worked with Fabiano Caruana. Right now he is working with Abdusattorov Nodirbek, top 10 grandmaster from Uzbekistan. Imagine what Anand is to India, Rustam Kasimdzhanov is to Uzbekistan. Anand goes knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. We have the Ruy Lopez opening on the board. Black plays a6, the bishop drops to a4, knight f6, and white short castles. Now remember, you cannot take this knight here because of this queen d4 move, which wins the knight and which wins the pawn basically, not the knight. So white decides to short castle, and after bishop e7 plays rook e1. Now the threat of bishop into c6 is a real threat. So if let's say black decides to go short castle here, they'll lose a pawn, because after this knight e5, queen d4 no longer works since the knight can just drop back to f3, and after this queen moves, the queen cannot capture the e4 pawn. So after the queen moves, let's say to d8, white can simply continue with development and he's up a pawn. So bishop into c6 is a very real threat right now. So to prevent it, black plays b5. The bishop drops to b3, and now black goes castle. Now whenever black plays short castle without playing the move d6 first, it means black wants to go d5 in one move. Black doesn't want to spend any time playing d6. Okay, and the move d5 marks the beginning of the martial attack. Okay, it starts after c3, d5. We have the martial attack on the board, and this opening is considered dangerous for white. So what many players do is that they just avoid facing the martial attack from black, and instead of playing the move c3 and allowing martial, many players will either play a4, either play d4, or play h3. And all these moves mark the beginning of anti-martial. Martial, anti-martial. You don't allow your opponent to play martial opening. I won't go into the details of each, but in the game Anand chose to play h3, and basically now d5 isn't that effective as it would have been if white had gone c3. So h3 happened, black goes bishop to b7, and white plays the move d3, black plays d6. Whenever black plays d6 and protects this pawn, it means that this knight no longer has the duty to protect the pawn, and the knight can actually go to a5 and capture this bishop. Okay, and there is one thing you must know in the Ruy Lopez opening. You want to make sure you don't lose this bishop for this knight. Okay, this is a very, very powerful piece. You'll soon see what it does in the game, but this is a very powerful piece. You don't want to trade it cheaply for the knight. So after d6, the threat is to go knight a5. White defends it with the move a3. After knight a5, white puts his bishop back on a2, and this bishop is gonna stay on this long diagonal. Black plays the move c5, and now you have a choice of what to do with this knight. How do you develop this knight? You can either go knight c3, but the standard way to develop this knight in the Ruy Lopez is to go knight d2, which is also what Anand plays in the game. And now the black knight drops to c6. Okay, now you may say, why did the knight go to a5 and it jumped back to c6? Well, if you see, the black knight first went to a5. After the bishop went, black took space on the queen side with the move c5, and then he dropped the knight back to c6. Okay, so black has managed to push this c5 pawn. So after knight c6, white plays knight f1. Again, very standard for Ruy Lopez. The idea is the knight will either go to g3 or it will either go to e3, both these squares. It will, from these squares, it will look at f5, and if it goes to e3, it will look at both these squares. Black plays the move bishop c8. b7, this bishop is literally having no targets. It is just staring at a pawn which is just rock solid, very nicely defended. Okay, so that's why the bishop decides to reroute itself to e6 and goes bishop c8 first. Anand goes bishop to g5. Now the point of bishop g5 is white wants to trade this bishop for the knight, and after this happens, black will basically find it harder to control the d5 square. So a very typical idea here is, let's say if black plays bishop e6, white will chop off this knight, chop off, and go knight e3. Now the thing is, white has two pieces that are controlling the d5 square, and white is going to put one of the pieces on d5. So that is the reason why bishop g5 was played. This is a very typical idea in this position, so just keep this in mind. But black didn't want to give up the knight, so black plays knight e8, and now bishop into e7. White trades off the dark squared bishop, knight e7, and the knight goes to e3. Now the knight can go to d5, and it's also keeping an eye on f5 square. Black plays the move knight f6. Now once again, there are two defenders to the d5 square, so white cannot really take advantage of this yet. Now in this position, white plays a very typical idea for the Ruy Lopez. He goes c3. The point is to go d4 and gain more space in the center. Black plays queen c7. White once again displays another classic idea in the Ruy Lopez. This knight isn't really active on f3. Okay, it is looking at this pawn, but this pawn is very nicely defended by the d6 pawn. Okay, if it goes to g5, it's not going to achieve much. So a very typical idea in Ruy Lopez is to put this knight on h2, and after this move, Anand puts this knight on g4. Okay, so this knight h2, knight g4 is a very typical way to play in the position. And now the thing is, if black captures this knight, white will take with the h pawn. And what this does is that it opens the h file for white. So how white will play is, white will first play g3 after this, put the king on g2, get this rook on h1, and just start attacking along the h file. Okay, sometimes he can even play g5, black plays something like h6, open the line for the queen, and just basically white is going to start an attack against the black king. This is very typical. There are many games that you'll see this plan in action. After knight g4, black obviously doesn't want to allow white to get an open file. If black doesn't play knight g4, white himself is going to capture this knight and give black a dirty pawn structure. So black retreats with the knight to d7, and now Anand plays the move queen to f3. Anand is getting his queen to also look at this d5 square and the f5 square. Black plays the move c4, shutting out this bishop. It may look that this bishop doesn't play much of an active role, but it still is going to exert some pressure in black's position, as you'll soon see. White goes knight f5 and once again asks black an uncomfortable question. The question is, white says, I'm going to play knight into e7. You cannot capture with your knight because after e into f5, this bishop is kind of trapped. It cannot go to d5. It just has no squares left. So how are you going to defend against this threat? That's the simple question. The better way to play here is to go rook e8 and just keep the tension. Just defend this knight with the rook. But what happens after bishop f5, ef5 is, now there is just nobody for black who can defend all the light squares that are there. This soon becomes a critical factor in the position. To stop white from playing f6, black himself has to play the move f6. But now it exposes this long diagonal. Okay, and now this c4 pawn becomes pinned. It can no longer take white's pawn, and it's going to come under a lot of pressure. White plays the move a4, adds more pressure to this entire queenside pawn chain. Okay, and this bishop, which kind of looked buried on a2, suddenly looks to be like, you know, the guy who is creating all this nuisance along this a2 g8 diagonal. Black played d5 to give more support to the c4 pawn. Anand plays the move knight e3, putting more pressure on these pawns, especially the d5 pawn. Black plays queen c6, defending the d5 pawn. And now in this position, Anand decides to go into an endgame and plays the move d into c4, and trades the queen. Anand believes that it is possible for him to take advantage of the weak light squares that are there in black's position. He plays a very interesting move. He plays b4. And what this move does is that it stops this knight from landing on c5, and it also stops this knight to go on this a5 square. So it kind of limits both these knights. And you may think that, okay, what happens after cb3? Then this bishop suddenly springs to life. bishop into b3 check, king h8, and you see the full power of Lopez bishop in action. Okay, it's just looking everywhere in black's territory. So black cannot play c into b3, which is why black went knight b6, forcing white to play a5, and then after a5 the knight dropped back to d7. Remember, you can't go knight a4 to hit the pawn because there is simply bishop c4 check, and white simply wins a pawn. You cannot capture here, you lose the knight. So after a5, the knight drops back to d7, and white plays rook a d1, hitting the knight. Black plays rook a d8, supporting the knight. And now in this position, the move that Anand played helped me overcome my chess related mindset block and widened my perspective and understanding of the game. If you want, you can pause the video and think. Alright, so in the game, Anand plays knight c4, sacrificing the knight, and after bc4, he took the pawn and grabbed one more pawn. So Anand sacrificed a knight, but he got 3 pawns in return. For me, I knew that a piece, a knight or a bishop is worth 3 pawns, but I would always hesitate to sacrifice my piece for gaining 3 pawns. Okay, I would not even consider or calculate the lines where I would get 3 pawns because I preferred pieces more than pawns. But what this game did is that it gave me a reference point to understand the power of pawns, to understand how to play when you have sacrificed a piece and you have 3 pawns and the enemy has a knight or a bishop for it. Okay, this game really gave me a reference, and that really helped me deepen my understanding of chess. So after bishop into a6, in the game, black played knight e7, trying to gobble this pawn. Well, just defending passively with knight b8 doesn't really work because the bishop is just too powerful here. Okay, after knight a7, like white can play a6. Yeah, the pawns are just going to start to roll. You'll soon see how Anand plays in the game. So after bishop a6, knight e7 was played in the game, attacking the pawn. Anand played bishop b7, knight f5, kicked this knight, and starts to push his queenside pawns. Black played knight b8, Anand pushes, knight c6, takes the rook, and goes b5. These pawns are simply unstoppable. The knight goes to a5, and Anand here plays the move rook a1. And in this position, black resigned because black cannot gobble this c4 pawn because there will be a7, and after knight b6, white is not going to even make a queen. White is first going to ask this b6 knight what it is doing, and only after the knight moves, he's going to take, and march forward with this second pawn. And this pawn is going to go to b7 and become a queen and help Anand win the game. So that's why after the move rook a1, white resigned and Anand won a beautiful game. Really helped me understand this material imbalance of knight versus 3 pawns. Let me know what was your biggest takeaway from the game. I have already shared mine. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to see another video on the Ruy Lopez, go check this out.